Hello, and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. I'm Chris.
And I'm Creston.
And I'm Chris.
All right.
Chris too?
It's Chris squared today. So we have got Chris Oliver here with us. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. We are going to talk about, now that things have kind of settled down, we're going to talk about the hosting landscape post Heroku. And I mean, Heroku still exists, but it's not the same as it was a year ago. And we got Chris on here because we wanted to, he's in the trenches with this stuff with Hatchbox, so he's real close to this issue. And I wanted to kind of lay this out, especially for people who are looking to try to figure out what's going on now. But before we get into the meat of things, hello, everyone, and in chat, Marco, Coderberry, David, how's everybody doing? Hope you guys are doing well. So we're going to do, where am I at? Week in review. That's right. Creston, how was your week?
Hopefully my dog won't bark anymore. So far, week's been super busy. I've been doing a lot of PostgreSQL consulting and dealing with logical replication and trying to use that as a technique for doing upgrades, because that can be advantageous when you're wanting to do some things that are more difficult just doing a stock Postgres upgrade. Like, for example, if you typically have correlation changes if you go from one operating system to another, which requires rebuilding every index in the database. And when you have the 15 terabyte database, that can take a while. Or issues where you aren't using partitioning and you have one table that's taking up 60% of the database, and you ideally want to partition that. Using logical replication, and this is something I'm working on now, might be a way to go from a non-partition table to a partition table, because you can actually have different structure. Like, at first you just carry over the schema, but then you can alter that schema and give yourself a partition scheme. And then when the data replicates over, it should replicate in a partition format. So basically that's a bunch of DBA stuff, but that's basically what I've been working on the past week or so. What about you?
Well, I've been most of the last week and up till about an hour ago, I was rebuilding systems after my computer crashed and trying to get ready for streams and making sure OBS was set up and all my sound mixing and all that stuff, and finally got that all straightened out. And I've been working, at work. I'm working on a project to automate and update our API documentation. So I'm actually using RSwag to automate the Swagger production from RSpec tests so that everything's automated and tested and doesn't get out of date, which will be nice. And after the show, I get to go put a new dishwasher in my house. So I'm wearing all the hats this week, just doing all the things. So how about you, Chris?
Doing some plumbing, eh?
Yeah.
You want to come over to my house? Our kitchen sink faucet is loose.
You don't want him doing plumbing for you.
No.
You missed the previous episode where he flooded his house.
I see. On that note.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, this week we've been so GoRails has had this Rails for Beginners course that we published a while back in, I think it was Rails 6.0 or 6.1, but anyways, Rails 7 comes out, changes all the JavaScript, and of course, the content's a bit behind. So we're basically redoing this with a little bit of extra stuff around it. So we're redoing the Rails for Beginners series, and I've been recording a bunch on that. And then we're introducing like some Ruby beginner stuff, and then some other like sort of prerequisite things, because a lot of people will come in wanting to learn Ruby or Rails and they don't know Ruby. So we'll have, explanations of like what the heck are these symbol things, and what's the difference between a string, and kind of the basics of that. Or if somebody's coming from PHP and wants to learn Ruby on Rails, well, you should probably learn some Ruby first, and have that along with it. So we're about to launch that here in the next couple of weeks, but been doing some recording on that. And last night I was up till midnight implementing file uploads to DigitalOcean Spaces, which claims to be S3 compatible. And then at the very end of this video, I upload a file in a form, and it works. And then I go to the edit version of the form, and the image just is broken. And come to find out, it's not 100% compatible with the S3 protocol, because somewhere in there, like, Rails would have to introduce an extra ACL to make sure that this file is marked as public instead of private. And so anyways, fun little nuances like that have been in the weeds on lately. That is it is the way that it goes. But I want to include some of this stuff in the beginner content, but I don't want you to discover a bug in Rails or whatever as your first project. So
well, I don't know. Maybe that'll help you dip your toe in the water.
Yeah.
Or jump in the deep end, as it were, I guess.
Your first Rails project, we're going to go, write a PR to fix Rails. And
that's not intimidating at all.
It's Rails for beginners on hard mode.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about, and this is a good segue, because one of the reasons I wanted to do this show was for beginners. I mean, senior developers have to deal with this stuff too, but figuring out how to host your Rails project, if it's not somebody at work doing it for you and you have to figure it out, it's a complicated environment to work your way around in. Now, a year ago, you used to be able to say, hey, just go do Heroku. It's free. You can figure it out. That's your thing when you're starting, right? That's not the case anymore. So now, since if you want to host something, you've got to put some skin in the game. You want to make sure that you're thinking about the requirements for hosting. And as a new developer, that's a big thing to wrap your head around, in addition to all the other things you're trying to wrap your head around. So I wanted to bring Chris in here to kind of help us understand what the landscape looks like, and what things you want to look for when you're hosting, and what questions you want to ask. And then what kind of, the post Heroku landscape, what does that look like, and how did that change your thinking about Hatchbox?
Yeah. Lots to dig in there.
Yeah.
I feel like we should start on sort of the beginner level of things, because what we've noticed with Hatchbox is a lot of people are trying to deploy their first Rails app, or even their 10th or something. And, they still don't quite understand how DNS works. And there's a lot of questions we get around SSL and other pretty basic things, but they're not really required to learn Rails until you go to production. And then you set it up once and you don't do it again until you set up your next application, because it just works afterwards. And you have to go relearn it all over, a year later or something. And a lot of this stuff is the same way. And I feel like too, this is definitely one of the pain points when you learn I guess it's not just Rails, but anything that's really not PHP or a static site, where you just dump it in a folder and your web server takes it and displays it. When you've got to run a separate process that your web server then talks to as a proxy, that gets to be a lot trickier too, to wrap your head around. How does this get organized and how does it work? Because you end up where we can talk from the top down, but your browser makes a domain request, and that's got to go look up the IP address and then send the request to that server. Then something on the server, typically Nginx or Apache or Caddy, which is what we use now, will be listening for that HTTP request. And then it sees that domain and it says, okay, you want to go send that request to this process, which will be our Rails process running on the server. And in development, we just get localhost and all that magic is kind of taken care of for us. But in production, you've got to configure your DNS records properly so that it points to the right server's IP address. But there's also quadruple A records instead of just A records for IPv6. And we've noticed sometimes people have their A record pointing to the server, but their IPv6 points somewhere else. And
Oops.
they aren't sure why, like, the request doesn't work. And it's like, well, it does sometimes on some device because it's using IPv4 instead of IPv6, and things get weird. And then you've got all the SSL stuff, which is a whole other like process if you're using Let's Encrypt, because instead of paying for a cert that you download, upload to your server, configure it to point to that file, and then you just do that process a year later, Let's Encrypt is like, well, we're going to give you short 3-month certificates that you renew every 2 months. You can start renewing at the 2-month mark. Those are something you don't want to have to do manually every month or
Right.
2 months. So that ends up being like another automated process, which we used to use their official certbot, and then that's written in Python, and it wasn't like the Ubuntu package wasn't maintained well, so then it just stopped renewing at a certain point. And then Python 2 versus Python 3, you have to make sure you have the right versions installed and its dependencies and stuff. So then the old Hatchbox switched over to Acme SH, which is this giant bash script, which should be compatible everywhere, but it's also bash and a nightmare to kind of maintain and read and understand what's going on and debug. So that eventually led us in the new Hatchbox to using Caddy, which was a godsend, because normally when you set up an SSL certificate, you have to, with Let's Encrypt, you have to go and set up your site. Then Let's Encrypt will go and ask your site for a little URL and make sure that it gives the right thing back to verify that you own that domain. And then it will give you the SSL cert after that's verified. Well, not realizing people already setting up their DNS correctly to point to the server, which, as we know, they may or may not understand and have set up correctly. So there's a lot of questions we would get about that. But what's super cool about Caddy is it can actually do it on demand. So there's a flag you can say, give me a Let's Encrypt SSL certificate during the first request that comes in. So in order for that request to even come in, you've already had to set up the DNS properly. So we don't have to do anything for the SSL certs anymore, for the most part, because the DNS is already done. And then we know for sure we'll be able to renew the Let's Encrypt certificate then. So that's been really cool as an improvement. But then all that's set up, and then finally you get to Caddy. Caddy says, hey, go ask the Rails app for this page. You need to be running your Rails app in a way that gets restarted automatically if it crashes, things like that. So typically you're going to need, if you're setting your server up yourself, you're going to need to have a process monitoring tool like systemd, have it run your Rails app. You got to give it your environment variables somehow, and you can do that through systemd, which is nice because you could have 2 Rails apps on the same machine, and they could each have a Rails master key, and they don't override each other because only one environment variable is allowed to have the same name there. So you'd have to go set that up and then set your own database up somewhere, either on your server, another server. If you did it on another server, you're probably going to want to set up firewall rules so that only those 2 servers can talk to each other on that port and so on. And yeah, file uploads and they're cron jobs, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff that you have to worry about setting up your Rails apps for the first time on your own servers, or effectively this is what's happening behind the scenes with Heroku or Render or Fly or whatever. But yeah, there's a lot to it.
Right. And and I'm kind of glad you went through that, because it sounds, and it is, complex. There's a lot of stuff to think about just to get to the point of accepting a request from something. It's not to mention the fact of serving an actual web page,
Yeah. And even like, okay, well now, right now, as of this recording, the latest long-term support Ubuntu server is Jammy 22.04, which no longer has OpenSSL 1.0 or 1.1. You have to use OpenSSL 3, or that's what it comes with in the package repositories, which means I think, if I remember right, only Ruby 3.1 and higher will compile on that. So if you're using even Ruby 3.0, which is pretty recent, you have to manually compile OpenSSL, tell Ruby to use your manually compiled OpenSSL version, and have fun with that. Like, it's just not... It's just not like, it's not hard to do, but it's just a pain in the butt, because you got to do all this compiling of extra things manually, which means you got to understand, your load paths and everything, and how to compile things from scratch on Linux. When what you thought you signed up for was building a Rails app and making a website, but now you're doing Linux compiling and stuff.
So that leads me. So if I'm a new developer and I'm trying, hey, I'm working on this Rails thing, and either I'm doing it for fun to learn, or I'm setting up this little app that I want to try out in the marketplace, and I need a place to host it, but I'm not a DevOps, I'm just a Rails developer, and I'm fairly new at it. So let's talk about, how do I maximize my ability to pick a good hosting service that is going to be the right one for me, because changing hosting services later is a non-trivial task. So you want to ask the questions up front and maximize your ability to get it right, up front. Now, it used to be Heroku is free. Yeah, it has some foibles, but I've got no skin in the game, so, But what questions do I want to be asking now?
Yeah, that's a good question to ask. I still feel like Heroku is a killer option, because it is so, it stayed the same for so long. Like, it's not brand new. So every issue you could possibly run into, it's already been done 1,000 times. There's documentation for it. And the only real downside to it is now there is no free tier, but there is a very cheap tier, which is good. So you can use a service like that where you don't really control anything. You have to play in their playground, and that's fine. So it ends up being that if you use a service like Heroku, Render, or Fly, or anything else that's kind of running containers, you have to build your code in a way that works with their container platform. So their logging is going to need to be set up where you log to standard out, so they can collect it and run it through a service. And you can't upload files to your disk. You can't SSH in and really do anything permanent, because they built a container around your code, and then they're going to throw it away next deploy and use a new version of that. So any files you upload, they're gone. And that's fine, but it also requires you to do some more complex things just to get started. So what we've built with Hatchbox is kind of like intended to be almost the Heroku experience, but we give you a server that's yours, and we help you set it up. And it works a lot like your local development environment, because we're not using containers. So you can log in, edit files, upload things, add extra stuff, and it works just like your own computer, because you control it. And we will help you set it up, basically, and deploy your apps with it and stuff. But you have to bring your own server. So what's nice about us is, like, versus Heroku, where they have European or US as the main regions that you can choose, we don't really care. You could have a server in your basement that's running Ubuntu server, and as long as it's connected to the public internet and you let us log into it, we can go set it up and you can use it from anywhere. So we have people in Australia that wouldn't have a local data center that they could easily get from Heroku or something, and they can use their local host in Australia, and we can, set it up for them and manage that. So, I feel like in a way, Hatchbox kind of fills that gap where most places are trying to do containers and making it as scalable as possible. And you can click a button and voila, you have 1,000 servers, and you can just click another button and now you have 5, and that's great. And Fly.io is one of the best ones with that in mind, because they are, if you are wanting that kind of stuff, they're intending for your code to be multi-region by default. So you can have effectively like you would use a CDN for your files, and I upload it once and it gets replicated around the world. You deploy your app and it's around the world, and everybody in any country will have a local copy that they talk to, like Netflix would do. They would send, the movies to local regions. So you're not downloading the John Wick 4 from across the world. It's like in your town, and they can grab it really fast. So they're probably the most future looking, which I really like, but there's a lot of, they're new, and so is Render, and Render is really trying to be like a Heroku replacement for the most part. Like the way they've structured everything is very similar to Heroku, and that makes it easy to kind of transition if you were looking to leave Heroku now that they don't quite have the same free offerings as before. But I was just using them, and you have to pay $7 a month minimum for even shell access. So if you wanted to run in to your container and run Rails DB seed, you got to pay money to do that, which seems very unfortunate. Like that seems like something that you should be able to do out of the box without, if they've got a free tier, you would think you would be able to do that. But, I think the questions are kind of, am I building something as a hobby? Then I want to look for something that's easy to play with and going to be cheap. And then if I'm building something that I really want to be able to scale, then you'll want to use one of those hosting platforms that's able to click a button and voila, in 30 seconds, you have 10 more servers or something.
So one of my option sliders really is on one side, it's the host system is auto magic. I don't have to think.
Yeah.
Down to I have complete control and I'm basically renting a VM.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
that's one of the differentiators.
And then I guess two, there's also like AWS Lambda. We talked to Ken Collins recently on Remote Ruby, and he's been building Lamby, and you can have it spin up these functions that are running your Rails app that just process like a request or two, and they can infinitely scale up as well. And you don't have to think about servers because that's all even abstracted away there too. So, it's another option, but it's also probably one where you need to be comfortable getting in the weeds of the AWS docs, because it's all pretty much configuration based stuff. So all of their million acronyms and all that, you're going to have to learn those docs and understand what those words mean. And I feel like
oh God, no.
They're just written very, very tersely sometimes too. And it's like, I can read this sentence 20 times and I still don't know what it means. Like it is, it's hard to grasp a lot of the AWS configuration stuff. Hell, if you're trying to set up cores on an S3 bucket, like you can copy paste examples and it still is like, oh, I don't know why it's not working. And
it's definitely written in a very specific dialect of programmerese.
Yeah, it is.
So let's talk a little bit about the overall landscape of let's say Rails hosting, but app hosting in general. There's no longer, I mean, if you want to host an app, you will have to spend some money somewhere, right? There's no free option. Even if you do it yourself, you're going to have to buy the bandwidth or buy the hardware or something.
Yep.
So
yeah, because you can go from a Raspberry Pi at home But you still got to pay for your internet. You still got to pay for your Raspberry Pi. You got to have something, because your home internet is not guaranteed to be a static IP address unless you probably pay extra for that. But you got to pay for that at some point. And then your next option would be like go to DigitalOcean or EC2 and grab a server, SSH in, set it all up yourself and maintain it yourself. And that will be $0 extra over the cost of your server or whatever. So Vultr might be a good example of that. They have like $3.50, 512 meg RAM servers, but they're like allocated half a CPU, but at least they're super cheap. And you know, if you really are worried about the cost, then that's a good option to do it yourself. But it's also in a data center somewhere, so it's got, you know, all of the support of everybody that works at Vultr. They've got a high bandwidth connection to the internet, all that stuff, like power redundancy, you know, all the fancy data center stuff that you do not have at home for reliability. So that's a good, you know, worth $3.50 a month. But you would have to go and maintain it yourself. And that can be a real pain, because unless you really know your way around Linux, there's a lot of nuances to setting that up correctly. And things still change all the time. And so you might rely on one repository. For example, even just recently, I have an old server that's running Ubuntu Xenial. Xenial, I believe, is no longer in the default repository for Postgres. That's now the like apt archive repository. So they'll still like provide those Postgres packages, but as of one day, it moves to the other repository, which means next time you apt update and upgrade, it's going to say, hey, that Xenial package no longer exists in the Postgres repo. And I was like, what? So then I start looking at their docs and realize it's been moved, and I got to go change my repository to point to that location now, and then everything's fixed. But you know, randomly stuff like that will break, and you thought it was going to be reliable forever, and it's definitely not. Yeah. But you do get the benefit of, compared to with maintaining your own server and using Hatchbox, compared to using a service like Heroku, Fly, or Render, where they're using containers. One of the nice parts is those services will charge you for each database that you set up, each application, each dyno, or you know, instance of your application. They will charge you separately for every application. When you use Hatchbox or you build your own server, you can deploy 25 applications to it and pay just for that one server. So that's really nice, because it's like me, I have, I don't know, 400 or 500, 600 repositories on GitHub, and a lot of those apps are deployed somewhere. And I definitely could not pay for that many apps to be running on Fly or Heroku or something. So, and especially too, their like database limits are like 10,000 records, and you know, you could generate 10,000 records for your test suite pretty easily to test something, and it's like, well, that's not a lot before I have to start paying for it. And also, like a Redis database, they may only have like 2 connections, so you can only run, you know, your Rails app in one background job at a time or something. And so it's kind of they're intentionally very limited, so you have to use the free tier very, very sparingly, or go straight to a paid tier. And then that means you got to pay for a dyno on Heroku. That's what a server is called, a dyno. And then you'd have to pay for Postgres and Redis for each application, which is probably going to be, I don't know, $25-$50 a month for each app.
Well, and that's something you have to really be careful of when you're getting into this into the hosting stuff and starting to learn it, is that a lot of the hosting stuff you don't think about up front. You see, oh, this is $20 a month. Okay, great, I can afford that. But what you don't see is, yeah, but if you want more than 10,000 records, it's also this, and then also this, and you get all these little a la carte things added on. And before long, you're paying $150 a month for this little app that you were just testing, right? And so So you want to think about those things, and you want to be careful about, well, what in 6 months, what is this going to cost me? That's great. It costs me this right now, but in 6 months, what will it cost me?
Yeah. And another important, metric when you're deciding where to host your stuff is, does the app make money or not? Because if it's an app for work, then like, what's $150 a month? Because
Right.
your salary is $10,000 a month easily or whatever as a developer. So what's $150 versus 10,000? It's not a lot in comparison. So if you were able to not pay someone to do that work of managing a server or something, then yes, pay that money, and we can, up until it starts costing more than an actual human being would, you don't really care. And then at some point you start evaluating, do we hire someone dedicated to this type of work? Can they do more than just this application? Okay, then that actually might be a lot more worthwhile to have somebody who can manage all of this stuff for us and accomplish more than just paying for a single app to be run or something. But
Yeah.
that's also pretty hefty application at some point that is probably pretty critical and likely making some good money. But
Yeah.
who knows? Maybe it's
it can pay for
GPT and it's GPT and it costs $3 million a month to run. So
Oh my Lord. That's I can't, that blows my brain up. Hey Brittany, how you doing? Welcome.
Hey.
So let's take a quick chat break, catch up on chat here. I'm glad everybody's here. How's everybody doing? Ken Tasmic, John Wick 4. I don't think that's on Netflix yet. But I'll have to go check after the show. Because if it is, I'm gonna watch it. Flies had really big struggles as of late because their systems weren't scaling properly. They had too much demand. Yeah. Well, I've seen that at some other hosting sites too. Not necessarily the Rails world hosting sites, but I seem to remember that Linode had an issue many, many years ago with something like that.
They're now Akamai. Did you know that? They
No.
got acquired recently?
No, yeah. I did not.
Wait, cool. Who did?
Yep. Linode is now Akamai.
So
it's like a week or two ago, maybe.
Brittany, we're glad you could come too. You're fun employed. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Well, since you said fun, I'm gonna assume that's good. So if I'm starting out, right, and I'm learning Rails, so I would recommend that at some point in your development career, assuming this is a career and you're not just investigating, do I want to do programming? You do want to set up a server and understand how it works and do that stuff. Maybe not for a mission critical thing, but you should go through that process so you understand what's in there. But if I'm trying to learn Rails and Ruby and programming and object-oriented stuff and all this, I don't want to think about that part yet, right? I just want to put it up there and run. So, and if I'm a starting Rails developer, I'm not making $1 million a year in my salary yet. So, I can't just throw endless amounts of money at it. So it seems like things like Hatchbox are a good option because I can quickly throw things up for very low cost every month. And it's not like I have to dedicate a server to this little project and dedicate a server to this little project. And I've got kind of a fixed budget in those. So I think you want to look for fixed budget things if you're starting out or doing side projects and stuff like that. Because you don't want that cost spiraling out of control.
Yeah, and if you get too ambitious and you're like, oh, we're going to set up auto scaling, and you don't tune that properly, you can end up auto scaling really high, really fast because you set the wrong metrics on there on accident, and you'll learn the hard way sometimes doing that stuff. But going back to your point, like I wrote, so the very first article on Go Rails was actually how to deploy to Rails to Ubuntu server. And that was the first thing I ever wrote, like a tutorial on the site, because I was learning Rails and I had built some apps and deployed them to Heroku, and it was all free. And I was just like, I want to know how Heroku works behind the scenes.
Mhm.
And all the Rails education stuff is pretty much just like how to build stuff in Rails, which is good. But uh, clearly, production is important. When you get a job as a Rails developer, you're going to be working on a production application. So you
Right.
might as well learn how that works. So I just realized, like, oh, I should go learn how to do it. And I was taking notes of all the steps and stuff, so just so that I knew what was important for what things and why, and a reference I could come back to and kind of do it again later. And I realized, like, oh, why keep these notes private? I might as well just publish them on a website. And I found that GoRails was not taken, so I bought the domain and threw that tutorial up there, and that actually became like linked to on Stack Overflow a bunch, and sent a ton of traffic to GoRails like in the first couple months on accident. And then I was like, oh, maybe people want to see more of this stuff.
And we
but
did.
It is really, yeah, it is really eye-opening to walk through it yourself for the very first time, because Puma does a lot for you, and then all of the DNS and web server and process monitoring and all that in development, just you don't need any of it. So you never even thought about it.
Right.
Localhost connects you right to your Puma server, and voila, you're done. But you've never had to like talk to another machine on the network or the internet to do any of your work up until that point. And then when you get into, I paid for a server, I don't even know how the hell to log into it. This is interesting. And you start learning about SSH and all these, like, what's an SSH key? And now you have to learn, like, there are different types of SSH keys, and Ubuntu no longer supports like the old RSA ones out of the box because they were less secure. So now you've got to learn these other nuances to it. It's really educational to go through that.
Yeah, and it's stuff that you never think you would need when you're starting your career as a developer. But what you find out is when you get into a production environment, a lot of the problems that you run up against are not code problems. They're infra problems. And you really have to understand what's under the hood to have any shot at troubleshooting those. So if you don't go through that process yourself of setting up a server and understanding what is Puma, what is Nginx, what is all this stuff and how does it work and how does it interrelate? There's a lot of moving parts in there. But I don't think you want to start there unless that's what you want your job to be, because that's a lot of stuff to wrap your brain around.
Yeah, it is interesting though, because with things moving to containers and Docker, it's kind of forcing that work that used to be, we just give it to Heroku or Hatchbox or wherever to take care of it for us. Anyone who's trying to get into Docker is like, oh, guess what? You got to go set up your environment in this little script and then have all of that basically happen in your imagination on this, container that we can't even really, while it's running the script and setting up the environment, we can't really just go in there and pause it and poke around and do stuff. Like, we have to write it, it runs it, and then good luck. Hopefully you got it set up properly. And now all that kind of DevOps work, it's kind of being shoved onto you as the developer. So I feel like in a way, more and more, it's becoming a required piece of the puzzle as a developer. Like, now you have to worry about, CSS used to be really simple where you would just write a CSS file, voila. But now you've got to run it through a preprocessor like PostCSS or Sass or whatever. And your JavaScript has to do all the same things, where it also used to just be, I write it in a file and I serve it up and we're done. But, everything now has a preprocessor. So your app, when you deploy or use Docker, you got to pre-process the environment and set up the variables and the dependencies and everything. And so, yeah, I feel like in a way from 10 years ago, all this has gotten more complicated. It's a lot more powerful too, but there's a lot more interconnected dependencies that are starting to happen over the last 5 years.
You used to be able to just plug your guitar straight to the amp. Now it's got to go through a pedal board and an effects processor and a preamp and all the other crap before the sound comes out. So, I will say though that this is one of those pendulum swing things, because 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you did have to know this stuff to be a developer, right? And then we got to a point where this is all offloaded to the cloud, but now it seems to be coming back to, well, you got to have a little bit of that knowledge now just to keep going.
Well, but you don't have to. Heroku still exists. You can get
this is true.
They do it all for you.
Yeah.
But be prepared to pay through the nose.
Yeah.
If your app grows.
Yeah, and there's definitely pieces of it too where it's like, if you are deploying a basic thing, like a basic Rails app, sure, it's very straightforward. But if you start needing a dependency that's not part of the base Heroku build pack, then, now I've got to learn, how do I inject stuff into Heroku's build environment and make it available to my application and stuff then. So in a way, like, as long as you're on the simple path, a lot of those those hosting providers take care of 99% of it for you, and it feels like magic. And then the second you need to step out in the weeds, you're like, I gotta know now all the environment stuff, like the Linux kind of things to set up this new dependency needs to be in my path somewhere so I can find it and my app can talk to it. But then on top of that, I need to know how it works in Heroku's world versus like on my own computer where I could brew, install libvips, and voila, I have image processing or FFmpeg, and I can process, videos. On Heroku, it's like, well, you kind of need to do the same thing, but it needs to work in our process so it gets put in the right place at the right time during our special build process. And then you end up with a little bit of, in a way, vendor lock-in, because you're building stuff that you couldn't portably, unless it's a Docker container, which can run anywhere. But, some of those do end up with a little bit of like, this is stuff specific to Heroku, and to move it somewhere else, we need to undo those changes, set it up in a slightly different way. And that was the goal of Docker, was do it once and it works anywhere. And, sort of that's true, but it
glossy brochures always sound good.
Development versus production.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like anything. It's like, if you want the easy path, you're going to get lead into vendor lock-in. So for example, if you choose Heroku and you get push it super easy, and then as you get more sophisticated, then they start nickel and diming you and cost. It's just like running your own database. You could have Amazon RDS do it, and then it's easy. But then as you get larger and larger, the dollar signs go higher and higher and higher. It's super more expensive. So whenever you choose the easy path, eventually it's going to run into more being spent more dollars, and you got to choose to potentially change the path that you're on if you want to.
Well, and that work is going to get paid for. You're either going to pay for it with money or with your time.
Or time. Yeah.
With time. Yeah.
So.
Yes, indeed.
But one of the things that I was curious about, and I think you'll probably know this better than anyone else, is before Heroku made their tiny announcement, that blew the world up, Hatchbox was a thing. But when they made that announcement, did that change your thinking at all about what Hatchbox was going to be and where it fit in this landscape? Or was it just kind of a business as usual for Hatchbox?
Because of the way that we've built it, intentionally built it, it's pretty much business as usual, because we don't use containers. And one of the things that we specifically do, I don't want to be on the hook. So all these services, like Heroku and Render and Fly, you are saying, hey, I would like to use, you put in your credit card, you don't get charged for anything right away, and then you spin up servers, and then you get charged for your usage. One of the things, me as at the time, an individual running this thing, I don't want to be in the hook for you signing up and saying, I want $1,000 a month server, and then I'm not paying you at the end of the month. I didn't want to be on the hook for that bill, so I ended up just setting it up so we run on your account. So if you want $1,000 a month server, DigitalOcean's going to bill you, and we'll also bill you for the management. But if we lost that, it's significantly less than $1,000 a month or whatever. You're just screwing yourself trying to do that.
Yeah.
And those tend to work really well if you want to build a service like that. Works well if you're a funded startup because you've got cash and you can sort of handle those swings or whatever. But intentionally, Hatchbox is designed really not to be an actual competitor to those. So we will set up your server, and we don't use containers, so it's a lot simpler to orchestrate and everything, which means that we can offer like a significantly cheaper service. So you can pay us $10 a month to deploy 50 apps to one server, and Heroku would charge you 50 times, however many databases and dynos and everything else that each one of those might need. So in a way, a heavy Heroku user who's taking advantage of auto scaling and other features like that, they're going to be better served by another, funded startup like Fly or Render or something like that. But on the other side, all of those free and hobby tier apps really fit well with us because we can give you a pretty significant cost savings if those small applications don't need auto scaling and they don't have a big Postgres database or Redis database or whatever. We can put all that stuff together on a couple servers or whatever. You could do each app on a $5 server or, however you want to orchestrate it. I run a bunch on one server, and then I've got dedicated servers for a few apps that are like more important and I don't want to share resources with others. And so we kind of fit that gap a little bit better for hobbyists and like small business, where especially if you're an agency and you're doing work for clients, if you're doing Rails development for 50 different clients and you're running and maintaining their sites, you're the ones deploying the code. So that might happen once a month or something for some of these smaller apps that don't need a lot of changes, but you need to maintain and run them. So why not put them on the same server and then cut the cost down? And as an agency, you could still charge $100 a month for maintaining the server or something for each customer and make a lot more profit with it. So we kind of fit a niche that nobody cares about because it's the small fish. We don't mind that. Like, that's fine for us. So it's pretty cool that effectively we've got this little niche that no funded startup gives a shit about. Like,
right.
They just don't care. And so that's cool. So I'm fine with that. And we did see a lot of new users trying out Hatchbox because of that, where they're like, look, if Heroku is going to charge us whatever their prices are, or get rid of the free tier entirely, which was the original announcement, and then they came back with like, oh, we'll give you X amount of hours for $5 a month or something, which is still reasonable. But if you had a lot of projects or whatever, you still have to pay a lot more than that, and you could effectively do a cheaper job on Hatchbox. So those kind of customers were noticing as well that, like, I'm paying whatever dollars, like $50 a month for a decent sized dyno on Heroku, but the equivalent $50 a month I could spend on Hatchbox with DigitalOcean would get me a significantly more powerful server and a faster one, because Heroku was running all these old AWS instance types. So they're just kind of slower, and they still, I don't know that they still even support HTTP 3 or HTTP 2 maybe? I can't remember. One of those, actually, it was HTTP 2 if I remember right. Hotwire came out and is heavily dependent on you having a persistent connection with the website to serve up these pages as fast as possible. So if you're renegotiating your HTTP request every single page view, the Hotwire improvements are not really as noticeable. So that was like a sad thing that was like, Heroku still doesn't support this. You would think after all this money and all these years, they would have supported that. And I remember DHH saying on Twitter, like, we can't use, unfortunately, you can't get the benefits, all the benefits of Hotwire or TurboLinks even, because you don't have a persistent connection on Heroku. It's caused a lot of people to look elsewhere as well. And you just notice that it's not as well maintained as it should be for functionality that's like paying them quite a bit of money, and they should be able to develop this and keep up with the times.
Right.
So people started looking elsewhere, and like, you know, with us running Caddy on Hatchbox, we enabled HTTP 3 a few weeks back. So you can use that as well, which has even got a lot of cool, interesting improvements over HTTP 2. It all runs over UDP, and it's kind of fascinating. But, you know, I think a lot of people were like, the pricing change was a reminder, like, they're getting stale and they don't have an incentive to really keep improving this product. They're owned by Salesforce. They're not an independent company that's fighting tooth and nail against Render and Fly and everything else. They're like kind of comfortable inside Salesforce, and they're not forced to like keep up with everybody else or stay ahead of everybody else. They were ahead, so far ahead, and now they're not. And so that was just a kick in the pants for everybody to like, yeah, let's start looking around. And we saw a ton of people start, you know, signing up. And luckily we got the new version of Hatchbox shipped around that time or before then, because I sure learned a lot between the initial version, which was more or less taking the tutorial that I wrote and automating that for a single server at a time. And then later on, you know, a month later, somebody's like, hey, can I set up a cluster? And I'm like, it's probably not too hard, but going from one to many is a giant problem. And so there was many things that we like just rewrote from scratch. And the new version of Hatchbox took like almost 2 years or more to rewrite everything and make it way more reliable and just polish all of those different features and stuff. And yeah, it has been a learning process. But upgrades like moving from Nginx and certbot and that Acme SH script for Let's Encrypt, that led to so many problems. And then Caddy version 2 comes out. It's got an API that you can just tell it to go change its configuration with an HTTP request. It's like amazing. So some of the like software upgrades that we've seen in that time has just been tremendous, and it makes hosting on your own server significantly easier. And DHH is working on that Mursk tool as well, that is a similar concept, but focused around kind of, you know, running containers for everything, but in a Kubernetes-esque fashion, but without all the complexity. And if you look at it, it almost resembles a Capistrano deployment, where it's like, go in, run all these commands, and we're done. And it's pretty neat too. So, you know, that's another option that I think will get more and more fleshed out over time, because they're investing heavily into it, because they're saving whatever, I forget what was $3 million a year or something from leaving the cloud.
Just a little bit of pocket change. So, and that kind of brings me to my last point that I wanted to raise with you, because I'm curious what your thinking is, or what you're seeing is, and that is, you know, when you talked about all this movement that was already kind of going on in this ecosystem, right? Even before Heroku did this thing. And then Heroku made this announcement, and if you were watching Twitter when that announcement came out, you would have thought that tomorrow the zombie apocalypse was coming. But in your opinion, were there really any fundamental changes in behaviors or availabilities or the ability for Rails developers to do what they needed to do from that announcement?
No, I think the announcement was mostly just fear of my Heroku account's got 50 or more apps on there that are all free. And it was just fear of like, is my credit card on file? Is it just going to be charged like $1,000 next month? Like, everybody is just kind of freaking out about what was going to happen with that for the most part, because that on Twitter I saw the majority of people were like, oh well, I guess I got to go find some alternative place to host my apps, and they just didn't do a good job of like, I don't know why they wouldn't have expected that response, because a month later or a few weeks later they were like, they're like, oh, sorry, we're going to offer a $5 a month plan with some basic hours and stuff. And it was like, well, why wouldn't you have thought about that and put that in the original announcement and not scared everybody? But it really doesn't change anything, because you can still deploy the same way. You will have to pay a little bit more. And I feel like, unfortunately, with that change, there's absolutely no reasonable free tier anywhere anymore. Like for Heroku to offer that free tier, it was pretty amazing anyways, because that was like gotta be an insane amount of like support. Like the amount of support questions that we get for Hatchbox is like the majority of the cost of our work. Like the maintenance of Hatchbox is very time consuming. Just keeping, 4 new Ruby versions dropped today. So I got to go compile all those Ruby versions, and we can deploy and compile Ruby during a deploy. But if you got a small server, it's going to compile Ruby by itself before you can even finish your deploy. So we like to pre-compile it, and that means that I got to go pre-compile 4 versions of Ruby for each version of Ubuntu that we support, all the LTS versions. The new version only supports the latest 2 LTSs, but that means we got to compile Ruby 8 times. Then Hatchbox Classic supports 3 Ubuntu LTS versions, so we got to compile Ruby 12 times for that. So we're already at compiling Ruby 20 different times for these, different configurations and stuff. And like, there's quite a bit of that kind of maintenance work that we've got to keep up with. But then lots of support. And then I can't imagine the abuse that Heroku was having to deal with. Like, why wouldn't I just grab a free dyno and slap a Bitcoin miner on there and just generate 1,000, 10,000 of those? Like, there's no, that was kind of the design, is like, you run anything you want on here. So I'm sure they had just an enormous amount of abuse. So I understand the, like, the reason of charging. That's why Hatchbox does not have a free tier, and we'll never have a free tier. We couldn't afford that. But unfortunately, the other options like Render, Render's free tier doesn't allow you to like even jump in and run a single command to run dbc. Like, that seems like it's very handicapped to the point where you can't even really use the free tier. You can basically edit the build script to run dbc'd for one deploy and then edit the deploy script afterwards to work around that. But like, you can't run a Rails console on there unless you're paying. And then if you look at Fly, their minimum free tier, or their like free tiers RAM is like 256 megs, which unfortunately Ruby and Rails takes typically like 512 to run. And so I think that's probably a little bit limited for running Rails apps. Maybe it's fine for other languages or something, but it's another one where it's like, well, there's literally no free tier that had the same kind of functionality that Heroku's free tier did. And it's an end of an era, because all these companies are realizing like, we have to make money to continue doing this. And
I mean, employees want paychecks,
Yeah, well, and unfortunately too, unless you're building something like we are, where we don't have to make a ton of money, we're not a funded startup trying to make billions of dollars for our investors who are forcing us to go that direction. Like, they have to go and charge for as much as they can, because that's the goal. And we keep it at $10 a month. We even dropped our prices from the old version, which was like effectively $15 a month per server, down to 10, because I was hoping that all the improvements we made would be significantly less maintenance and stuff, and we could just better serve that like hobby market that I want to build this for myself. I want to use it. And if I'm already paying $20 a month for a server on DigitalOcean and another $10 to maintain it, like that's something I can afford as an individual, and that's okay. But I don't want to spend $100 a month for my side projects and stuff. That starts to, add up really fast. And then you're like, well, do I run my side projects or do I keep my Netflix, And as an individual or, hobbyist or a lot of our community too is entrepreneurs. Like that's why I got into Rails in the first place. Like I love the community being entrepreneurship and building businesses. And that was kind of where it came from in the beginning. I want to support that. So, we're trying to keep it as cheap as possible. And it's like, probably breaks even for the amount of work we have to put into it every week or every month. But it means we can keep the lights on and everything. And that's cool. So that's good.
But, keep your Netflix at least till John Wick 5. There you go.
Yes.
Important safety tip, y'all. Keep your Netflix till John Wick 5. So, all right. Well, we're up on an hour. Chris, thank you so much for coming and sharing your insight on that. I'm glad you did, and you're the perfect person to do that because you are in the trenches on this topic. So, if anybody knows about it, you me. So, we really
thanks for having me. It's it's a particularly interesting time where feels like everything's changed all of a sudden in the last few months, where you knew it was leading towards change, but when that announcement came out from Heroku, everybody was like, oh, this is happening. This is real. Like,
and we have to pay attention.
In a recession.
So thank you so much for joining us, Chris. And thank you, chat, for coming and hanging out with us and chatting, having some fun with us. Chris, we always love having you on here. You're a great guest because I don't have to talk very much. You've got lots of stories, which is nice.
Yeah, I love your show, so I'm glad to participate. I really have fun talking to you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we will be back next week with another surprise show because I haven't booked anybody yet. So if you've got any ideas, chat, for somebody I can book on the show, or you want to come on the show and talk about a topic, reach out, PM me on Twitter. We'll make it happen. Also, in about 15 minutes after the show ends, I will be hanging out on our Discord chat to answer any of your streaming questions for a little bit. So if you guys want to jump by for that, if you're not a member of the Discord links are, well, they're on the screen, but good luck remembering all the funky weirdness, but it's pinned on the Twitter account. So we've got it there. So you can find us on Twitter at DuckyDevShow. You can also come to rubberduckdevshow.com and sign up there for our newsletter, which at the moment is basically us saying, hey, our show is out. But you can also find our shows and other stuff there. And Creston, you finished that outro. I forgot you're doing those now.
Well, you pretty much concluded it. So, well, anyway, thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you again, Chris, for joining us. And we shall see you next week. So, happy coding.
Happy coding.